Welcome to the fourth episode of the series, The Reception of the Zohar, A History, here on Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Episode 4 picks up where we left off with Haskalah, the 19th century, with its main focus being on Shadal, Shmuel Lutzato, and Benamozegh, and notably their disagreement throughout their Sfarim, Shadal's Vikuach al Kabbalah, Benamozegh's Tam Lashad, as well as their correspondence through letters. J.J. Kimche just published a new translated and annotated edition of Shadal's Vikuach, so you can check out that, link to that in the show's notes. And he also edited the letters of Shadal, Benamozegh, and that also contains letters between Rav Yichya Kafach and Rav Kook, and that will be discussed on the next episode. This episode will discuss some other figures, and we'll end with the 20th century. And episode 5 will focus on Rav Kook, Yichya Kafach, as well as modern approaches, academic approaches, and so on. I did want to mention, as it pertains to episode 3, where we focused on Rav Yaakov Emden and its Matpachas Farim, so I did link to the original Altona edition. There is an edition that was put out, a new edition, but that's hard to get. But I have, and that doesn't have notes, but I have a friend that worked extensively on Matpachas. He edited it, put in many notes and things like that. For various reasons, he stopped working on it. And so I actually have it in a Word document form. And he's looking for someone who wants to finish or fund the project to finish it. And if anyone's interested, it's a really impressive work. He did an amazing job. And again, Matpachas is very hard to come by today in a new edition as it is, and it doesn't have notes and sources and things like that. So if anyone's interested, they should please reach out to me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can WhatsApp me. You can find my number if you're on the WhatsApp chat. You can reach out that way. This episode of the series is anonymously sponsored by a friend of the podcast, an owner of the podcast. To sponsor an episode on the podcast or to support the podcast in any way, you can email me, sfarimchatter@gmail.com, or you can check out the link in the show's notes. You can also find the link in the show's notes to subscribe to the WhatsApp community, where I post new Sfarim, new books, book deals, and so on. Also, if you can subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you listen, and of course, if you can rate and review it, especially on Apple, so Apple, Spotify, 24/6, and so on. And of course, any and all feedback is welcome. I will try to respond in a timely fashion, but if you can respond via email or WhatsApp, your comments, what you think of this series specifically. We are looking to potentially do a reaction episode to feedback, so any and all feedback is appreciated, and enjoy the fourth episode. Hi everyone, welcome back to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast, and the fourth episode here in the ongoing mini-series, The Reception of the Zohar, A History. And I'm going to be joined once again by J.J. Kimche, who's been joining me for all these episodes. Thank you, J.J., for joining again.
Nice to be here, Nachi. Good to be back.
So last episode, we discussed really the 18th and I guess early 19th century. We ended off with we talked a little bit about Chassidus, Chassam Sofer, the Goyin. We had a lot of different things at the end, a lot of different moving pieces, mainly we focused on Rav Yaakov Emden and some other parts in the last episode. This episode, we're going to move on into the Haskalah and their attitude towards Kabbalah and their attitude towards the Zohar. And the bulk of this episode, I think, maybe a little bit, not in the beginning here, but the bulk is going to be dedicated to discussing Shadal, Shmuel Lutzato, and Benamozegh, Benamozegh, Shadal writing the Vikuach al Chachmas Kabbalah, and Benamozegh writing Tam Lashad, his refutation, and there's also a letters. I want to mention here at the outset, although we're not going to start with that, but I do want to mention that JJ is publishing a brand new translation and annotated edition of Shadal's Vikuach. He's also edited and published a book called Letters on Kabbalah, Correspondence between Two Schools of Jewish Thought, which features, it actually has out of order, but it says featuring Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Kook and Rabbi Yichya Kafach and Rabbi Benamozegh and Shadal. Should be flipped. But anyways, and Rav Kook and Rav Kafach we'll get to in the next episode, on episode 5. But for this episode, it will be Shadal and Rabbi Benamozegh. So those two books JJ's actually published. But we will leave that for later in the episode. Let's start off where we were, if you will, around the time period. We start off with the Haskalah and kind of, JJ, maybe also, I'll say this before I even start, maybe give a little bit of a short explanation of what the Wissenschaft was and what that movement was and why that's important for the Kabbalah, if you can, just like, you've said al Regel Achas a lot during this series, so something like that. Go ahead, JJ, I'll turn it over to you.
So firstly, certainly I can. And we'll get to the Wissenschaft a little later on, because that is a slightly later stage. That is already the second quarter of the 19th century. But we're going to start a little bit earlier on. We're going to start off in the late 18th century with the European Haskalah, specifically centered in Berlin, etc. And I want to thank you, coming on again. And especially, this is the episode I've been looking forward to, firstly because it discusses people I enjoy reading, but most importantly, it's because this is the episode that I get to flog some of my books. And for what else are we here in this world other than to do activities like that? So we're going to start off. We discussed to great length last episode of Yaakov Ender and his position in the mid to late 18th century in Central Europe. We also mentioned his epistolary correspondence, his letters back and forth between him and Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn, of course, being the major figure at the heart of the Berlin Jewish Haskalah. He was by no means the only figure, and he also wasn't really the main polemical figure, if that makes sense. In other words, Mendelssohn was held up as the great model, as the Jew who could be both a really serious and well-respected German philosopher in general, and also a serious Jewish thinker at the same time. And it's important to note also, because I know the sort of audience who listens to these episodes, is that when we talk of the Haskalah, much like the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment upon which it was based, we have to distinguish a little bit between different types of maskilim, especially because many of the maskilim, especially the earlier ones, did not at all conform to the kind of negative stereotype they would later get on within rabbinic literature. What I mean by that is people like Mendelssohn, people like Naftali Hertz, Wesley, many others will discuss Shadal later. These were, by and large, very learned Jews. These were people who were fully Shomrei Halacha completely, people who were, deeply committed to the Judaism and the Jewish future. At a certain point, they became also the more radical maskilim, people like Friedlander, Hertz Homburg, and others. And there were many different, I would say, types and a wide array of people who fall under this general genre of maskil, and therefore it's unwise, let's say, to tar them all with one brush, and especially because certainly Mendelssohn, for instance. I mean, I've often considered if Mendelssohn was alive today, I imagine he'd probably be a professor of philosophy at Yeshiva University. That's a sort of person we're looking at. Wesley would have probably been, the headmaster of a modern Orthodox high school. This is the kind of, again, obviously, transposing them into a completely different period. But the point remains that many of these people have a kind of black mark against them within the more yeshiva world. But actually, if you look at their writings, if you look at their opinions at the time, many of them were, would have been entirely unobjectionable in the 20th, 21st century, or largely so. And as we mentioned before, it is no coincidence that Moshe Mendelssohn had this ongoing correspondence with Rav Yaakov Emden, among many other rabbinic scholars. And this wasn't considered to be something remarkable or extraordinary or terrible or anything. Anyway, that is a little bit of background. With regards to our subject today, about specifically the Zohar and the and his dating and Kabbalah in general. So these early maskilim, especially in the writings of Mendelssohn, it doesn't appear very much. They didn't appear so interested in it. They didn't grow up with it so much. It wasn't something that they focused on to a great deal. Mendelssohn himself seems to have agreed with the conclusions of Rav Yaakov Emden, right? Generally, he quotes him, and seems to have accepted his position that perhaps there is some sort of small core of genuine and ancient material in the Zohar, but generally the Zohar and generally Kabbalah is an accretion of much later ideas, much later sources, etc. But nonetheless, Mendelssohn had a fairly distant relationship with it, and that's why, incidentally, he could treat it with a certain amount of respect, right? He referred to it, I think, in some part of his writings as an Oriental philosophy, right? As something that was, something somewhat exotic, a little bit removed from what he was trying to do in his project, and others of his generation referred to it as such. There was one time actually Mendelssohn did quote the Zohar approvingly, which is the introduction to his Pirush on the Book of Kohelet, right? So he wrote this quite famous, quite influential Book of Kohelet, and Mendelssohn came up, this is actually a bit of a chiddush of his. In his mind, the entire point of the Book of Ecclesiastes is that it teaches the immortality of the soul, right? The idea that after death there is another life, Hevel Havalim Hakol Havel on this earth, and however there is another time and another place and another world in which your immortal soul lives, and that's the correct and right place to be, etc., etc. And in his introduction, which has been translated in a collection of Mendelssohn's Hebrew writings, translated into English by Yale University Press, and a few years ago. And in his introduction there, he says, and Judaism has long believed in the immortality of the soul, and quotes one of the authorities for that is the Zohar. So again, it wasn't something he disparaged at all, but also wasn't something he saw fit to talk about so much. There were also of this slightly within the Maskilim camp, some of the early ones, such as Solomon Maimon, and even some of the later ones, such as Nachman Krochmal, who also had this kind of general respect, I would say, for Kabbalah and the Zohar, especially Nachman Krochmal. He had these, it's very complicated, but essentially he had these ideas of these sort of cycles of history, both general history and Jewish history, and he believed that there was once a kind of pristine mystical doctrine within Jewish writings, but over the centuries and over the generations, it got, it became decadent, became corrupted, etc. But nonetheless, you have sort of the stirrings of, I would say, again, a fairly distant but also fairly respectful attitude towards Kabbalah. That is on one side of the Maskilim, especially some of the early Maskilim. However, as the decades wore on, and many of those who are familiar with the history of this period will know this, as the decades wore on, the Maskilim became vigorously involved in a three-way fight that was occurring basically in Central Europe, actually mainly in Poland, between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim and the Maskilim. And this was taking place really in the early decades of the 19th century, the end of the 18th, early decades of the 19th century, and mainly taking place in Poland/Lithuania, because, of course, further east in the Russian Empire, the Hasidim were very, very strong, and further west, Hasidim and Misnagdim were basically largely ignored because they didn't really gain traction in France or Germany or Italy or other places. However, in Poland, where there were hundreds of thousands of Jews living at the time, this was a very serious fight between these various camps, and each one, denouncing the others, and each one accusing the others, and each one even telling on the others to the authorities. And there's quite a significant history to that, and I'm sure you can read up on that. And because of that, within this slightly more Eastern and generally sometimes a bit later generation of Maskilim, you have some of the most vicious criticisms of the Zohar there is. And this often takes a new genre, a new literary form, which is that of parody, of satire, of the writing of Purim Torah or of Kuntrasim or of these spoof dialogues, which place Kabbalists and rationalists in conversation with each other and that sort of thing. They're often different characters put in the mouths of sometimes it's Rambam, sometimes Mendelssohn, sometimes it's various different Kabbalistic figures, etc. And it is in these often you find the most attacks on the character of the Hasidim, or as they were often called then, Mitchasdim. That's quite an important difference for those who are sensitive to the Hebrew language. Mitchasdim is quite different from Hasidim, and I'll let you figure that out for yourself. But within that context, you often have attacks on their character, attacks on their seemingly very strange practices, hopping up and down and clapping and doing somersaults during davening, and all these, sleeping until all hours of the day, and getting riotously drunk, and sort of attacking those. And of course, to sort of further the attacks against the Hasidim, there were often attacks on not so much the antiquity of the Zohar, that was almost taken as a given, but rather attacks on the ethical and religious propriety of the Zohar. In other words, they really saw many of the proclamations of the Zohar, many of the customs, many of the halachas, many of the things that were part of the Zohar as not only not authentic, but actually detrimental, actually morally corrupt, actually something that nobody should take seriously at all. And this was a running theme. So I'll mention a few of the major works in this category. One is a book called Ktav Yosher, which was published in 1794, and it ridicules and mocks Kabbalah. This was written by Shaul Levin Berlin, who was actually an interesting figure in of himself, because he was the one who forged the book Besamim Rosh, and it's a compilation of Sheilot HaTshuvot that he attributed to the Rosh, from the 13th century, and some were caught up in it, and there's a whole back and forth. Was it a forgery? How much of it is a forgery, etc., etc.? Once again, a rabbit hole, very interesting. Not going to go down there for the time being, but nonetheless, he was actually himself, one of these rebel maskilim who was also serious Talmud Chacham, and not easy to forge an entire set of Shalos and Shuvos from the Rosh, right? I mean, you have to have brains for that. Anyway, so that was one example of Ktav Yosher. Another one is a dialogue by another maskil, also in the late 18th century, book called Aaron Wolfson, called Sicha Be'eretz HaChayim. And this is a dialogue between also Rambam, Moshe Mendelssohn, and some and a Kabbalist. Again, the Kabbalist being especially portrayed as stupid, as just oblivious, as ignorant, and there's many other undesirable qualities imbued within him. And the Sicha Be'eretz HaChaim, it ridicules the Zohar, and especially the anthropomorphisms within the Zohar, and this is a point we'll get to later. However, the one that is most interesting in this category is a later book by Yehuda Leib Mises, and this is called Kinat HaEmet, published in 1828. And this is, it's a vicious, vicious attack on the Kabbalah and the Zohar, and basically sees that all the evils that all the suffering, all the bad shape in which the Jewish nation finds itself then in the mid-19th century, as oppressed, as subject to anti-Semitism, as ignorant, as mired in backwardness and superstition, and all the things that the Maskilim wanted to throw off, wanted to emancipate themselves and the Jewish people from, is laid at the door of the Zohar and Kabbalah. So, basically, if not for this book, if it weren't for the fact that whole massive communities of hundreds of thousands of people were still enthralled to the, in his eyes, absurd theology and strange legal practices and religious practices of this book, then surely the Jewish people will be able to break out of its shell. Surely they'll be able to join European society. Surely they will be able to educate themselves in the arts and the sciences and actually take their place as full citizens within European society. And basically, this is, if you want to read one book of this genre, I'd recommend this book, because it throws everything at the Zohar, including saying that, its ideas are either made up of whole cloth, they're rooted in pagan superstitions, in Gnosticism, in Hellenistic philosophy, and full of angels and demons and amulets and ghosts and all the sorts of things that by the mid-19th century, a rationalist, maskilic-oriented sort of Jew saw as emblematic of everything that was wrong and evil about the past. And therefore, this Kinat HaEmet is the ultimate, I would say, scathing and wounding broadside against the Kabbalah, again in this new genre of parody, of spoof, of satire, and that's I think that's a wrap on that particular kind of anti-Zoharic activity, which again wasn't so accepted in the rabbinic world, but among that generation of Jews who came from the rabbinic world, who were educated in the rabbinic world, who knew it, but nonetheless were breaking out of their shell and joining a more maskilic sort of European Republic of Letters. That is an important genre which we must speak of.
Okay, so a couple of things here before we turn to the Wissenschaft, which is, first of all, you mentioned Shaul Berlin. He came I did an episode on Mordechai Benet. It came up in there. He was part of that, Pesam Reich, and Shaul Berlin also wrote works kind of under a pseudonym against Raphael Hamburger, the Rabbi Yanahu, and he went against him. So there's a couple of things about Berlin. Obviously, for this podcast, like you're saying, it's not really relevant to discuss him. But a couple of things on this time period that we're talking about. So as you say, and also we mentioned last episode how Shir, Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, he wrote, notes against Ben Yochai of Kunitz, responding back to the Matpachas farms. He also fits in kind of this rabbi maskil figure. But that's also a key that I want to follow up. Before we get to the Wissenschaft, these figures that we're talking about, this is the time of emancipation around Napoleon, after Napoleon. This is what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the the countries in Europe at the time. And also, there's also reform. The reform movement is starting, and we have the religious questions. So these figures that we're talking about, are these the ones that we're talking about right now that you've just mentioned, are they religious? Mm-hmm. And you mentioned maskilim. Maskilim, this is something that I haven't explored as much on the podcast, but just to say it, as you keep, you say regalachas. It's not. There's no maskilim is like painting with a broad brush over centuries, and they're different culture, different places, different cultures, different people. There are some religious, not religious, different types. So we're not just gonna, they're not all the same. You can't just put all maskilim in one basket.
Of course.
So when we're getting to these maskilim, though, what are we talking about here? What type of figures are you generally talking about with the works that you just mentioned?
So there is a range still. I believe Charles Levine Berlin was, very much this rabbinic type. The truth is, the problem with some of these figures that I mentioned were that they were more minor, and our biographical knowledge of them is less. Right? We know, basically where they were born, where they were lived, et cetera, et cetera. We know of their writings. Their writings are often, very prolific and specifically directed against Hasidim generally and other mysticism. As far as I know, these people were fit the mold of the Eastern European maskil, which means essentially religious. I mean, essentially, these people weren't the kinds of maskilim who were, or let me put it this way: although there were some maskilim who crossed the line. Most of what we have in our mind, certainly growing up in yeshiva education, as the maskil is this Jew who sort of threw off all semblance of Judaism, who assimilated into wider society, who became, a Germanic doctor or a lawyer or something, all that sort of stuff. That's not what we're talking about. These people aren't writing treaties, which are very, suffused with Torah sources and knowledge and written in complex rabbinic Hebrew. I mean, that's not what we're talking about. So the people who are typically writing these books are the sorts of people who come from that Cheder Yeshiva world, to a certain degree leave it, but largely remain within those circles. The specific particulars of the last two figures who I mentioned, namely Aaron Wolfson and Yudleib Mises, of their religious level, I don't know. I haven't really seen, or I'm not sure if anyone knows the particulars of their religious sort of observance. But nonetheless, I think you can safely assume that kind of maskil generally, who is still writing, who is still participating, and again, I said this sort of maskilic Jewish Enlightened Republic of Letters, many of them were, more in the Shadal or Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport mold of serious scholars who were very much religious.
Yeah, not trying to be matzdik them or say that these were overly religious figures. I mean, they probably weren't to some extent, but that's not that. Was just the point was generally to try to give like a general understanding of what type of maskil we're talking about, that the listeners should kind of understand that. Okay, so there we have, and of course we're going to get to like the Geiger, the Reform kind of Wissenschaft, scholar. Okay,
that's all a bit later. That's what we're talking about mid to late 19th century.
No, correct. My point just is those are the Reform, completely not religious.
Yes,
we're not talking about. Yeah, good.
Well, even again, I have to correct you again, because Geiger's a good example. I mean, many of these earlier Reform figures, again, were, firstly, very learned. Secondly, many of them had a quite full halachic life. Now, again, you'd have to be a very serious biographer in order to gain the precise extent of how much some of these figures were keeping, the prite pratim of every halacha, but a lot of them did. Again, there's a broad range, but still, even the early Reform days, you could still point to many people who were seriously engaged and involved. Yeah,
painting with a broad brush. I mean, Geiger, I think, originally learned with Rav Hirsch at some point. He had some connection with him. They were in university together. I forget exactly.
He was a colleague, yes. He was a colleague
of his. So again, later on, it goes on to head Reform. Just painting with a very broad brush. You're trying to at least give for the context of what we're talking about, say, maskil. Okay, now I'll turn it back to you. Let's move on to the next stage.
Yes. So the next thing. So, but by the way, if anyone's curious about the about what we're talking about now, the Wissenschaft movement and Geiger specifically. So on my podcast, I had a good conversation with David Myers on the Wissenschaft and also Susanna Heschel on Geiger specifically. A lot of very interesting stuff. But anyway, again, really, really al regel achad, because it's not the rabbit hole I want to go down at this point, even though we could do an episode or two on the Wissenschaft. The Wissenschaft as Judentums very simply were a group of Jewish scholars in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, and onwards who basically founded the field of what we might call academic Jewish studies today. In other words, these were people who were raised religious, many of them remained religious, and they were taught all the traditional Jewish texts and ideas, etc. But they started looking at Jewish history and Jewish texts from the point of view of the academic university tools, not the tools of the Beit Midrash, right? So they would often study the same texts or the same people, but removed from the various assumptions of the Beit Midrash, right? So, I mean, I'll give an example. One of the most famous Wissenschaft scholars was a man called Heinrich Gretz, a German historian, and he wrote his magnificent 11-volume Geschichte der Juden, the history of the Jews. And one of the volumes, I think volume 3 or volume 4, was a volume basically on the Mishnah and the Talmud. Now, of course, if you are within the rabbinic world, so you look at the Mishnah and the Talmud as part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, as, based on halachic rulings that have been passed down for centuries and centuries, etc., etc. But of course, if you're a Wissenschaft scholar, so you're essentially university trained. You're using the tools of the historian, the tools of the philologist, etc. And so the questions you're asking and the kind of framework you're seeking to apply is very different, right? So Gretz is asking questions like, to what extent did the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud, to what extent were they participating in the kind of philosophy and legal norms of the world, of the Greco-Roman world or of the Babylonian world? To what extent did they participate in their time? To what extent were they influenced by others and influence others in turn, etc.? And these are the sorts of questions, to what extent can we trace historical development from one generation to another, and how do they influence each other, and who innovated and where and how? And these are using the tools of philology, for instance, to pry apart the Talmud and show that this stratum was written earlier, and that this other Shichva stratum was written later, etc. And these are all examples of things that you don't get in a Beit Midrash, but you do get if you are a historian trying to find out the correct text and context in which these works are written. So you had a whole cadre of them. Now, what's interesting about the Wissenschaft des Judentums is that the people who were part of it ranged widely across the religious and denominational spectrum, right? So obviously you had people like Abraham Geiger, who was one of the founding fathers of the Reform movement. You had Heinrich Gretz, and especially his boss Zachariah Frankel, who were part of the what later became the conservative movement, but it was something much closer to sort of conservadox, their views at the time, and of course you had later on people like Hoffman, who also was a sort of semi-Wissenschaftler. He used many of the ideas and constructs and texts and findings of the Wissenschaft movement, even though he himself was a very important Orthodox rabbi. And you had a wide spectrum. However, for most of the Wissenschaft scholars in mid to late 19th century Europe, one of the things they were trying to do, what was one of the main goals of all their studies, their academic studies on Judaism, was to essentially demonstrate to their peers in the German universities, which, by the way, they were never allowed in. They were never given professorships and actual positions at German universities, but their role was to attempt to show other scholars that Judaism was a serious civilization. It was a civilization worth discussing, a civilization that was rich and ancient and multifaceted and had many, twists and turns. And there was a rich intellectual history and a rich cultural history and a rich, economic history and social history, etc. And therefore, they were involved, certainly to a certain degree, in a process of what I might call purification or attempting to present Judaism in the most palatable light possible for their peers in the German academia, who were, of course, the forefront of sort of Germanic, European respectability, right? And, of course, one of the things they therefore had to do was either minimize or set their face against Kabbalah, right? Jewish mysticism was perceived by the vast majority of them as a bit of an embarrassment, as something that was an aberration within the history of Judaism, as something that Judaism that didn't really represent the true, let's say, core unfolding of the Jewish idea, as Gretz would put it, but rather was something that came along and sort of has been hanging on to Judaism. What is the true Judaism in their eyes? Something much more of the rational tradition, Saadia Gaon, Rambam, Yehuda Halevi, or halachic perspectives as well. Basically all of the exoteric works of Judaism. That is the main thing. That is the true thing. Now, it is true that most of the Wissenschaft scholars, including Heinrich Gretz and including Geiger and including the most important, actually the foundational scholar of Kabbalah in that era was a man called Adolf Jelinek, who was a sort of reform rabbi. Not too many rabbis nowadays with the name Adolf, but at the time was considered more respectable. And he published a bunch of books between 1850 and 1855, including translations of important Kabbalistic texts. But anyway, these scholars, they paid close attention to the Kabbalah, even if they didn't like it. And this is actually something quite new, because Gershom Scholem in the 20th century basically said of these earlier 19th century Wissenschaft scholars, they didn't know anything. They were just ignorant. They didn't know anything about Kabbalah, didn't write anything. I think Scholem quotes as saying, not a single sensible thing was written about Kabbalah in the 19th century. And basically, recent scholarship has shown this is nonsense. There was a very good book by Yaakov Kohler, George Y. Kohler, at Bar Ilan on the subject a few years ago. And basically showing that these people, even though they didn't like Kabbalah, even though they were believed it to be an aberration, even though they believed it to be something that had to be excised from Judaism here and now in order to present it in a more palatable and a more enlightened fashion, they still knew a lot, and they still did very good analysis. They still collected all the manuscripts from libraries and wrote quite extensively on them, and footnoted them and did philological and historical analysis, etc., etc. So even though the Wissenschaft were set themselves against Kabbalah, they were still nonetheless very the ones who delved into it, the one who made it their business to write about it, were still very much involved in it. And one important factor from the Wissenschaft scholarship, especially from Gretz, is his notable hostility towards Kabbalah and his accusation that the Zohar specifically, his findings that it was written by Moshe de Leon. This was something that he quite famously wrote about. And gave very good grounding, very good reasons for believing this to be the case, making the case sort of philologically and by comparison to De Leon's other works, etc. However, he saw this as an act of forgery, as an act of terrible swindling of the Jewish public by writing in the name of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and then pretending to be your own. He saw that. He took personal umbrage at that and saw Moshe de Leon as a terrible forger and a swindler. And as we'll see later on, this is subject of later discussion, especially by Gershom Shalom and others, because of the question, well, if Moshe de Leon did write the Kabbalah, how are we to understand it? What is the genre? What is this in fact forgery? Is it something else? Is it we'll discuss that when the time comes to it. Anyway, before moving on from the Wissenschaft people, we also ought to know that this was a golden age in the 1830s, 40s of publication, firstly of Kabbalah scripts, manuscripts, little treatises and books that were found in various libraries were put into print, and more importantly for our purposes, both the Bechinat Hadat was published in 1833 with a commentary by Yitzhak Shmuel Reggio, and the Ari Nohem was published in 1840 by another man who's a journal editor called Julius First. And basically, these newer editions were much more popular than previous ones. Sometimes they were much more widely circulated, because of their entry into the library of Jewish scholars around Europe. So suddenly these ideas of Kabbalah versus anti-Kabbalah became a much more common currency of discussion. People were picking up these books, people were reading it, people had access to these texts. And there's one wonderful passage, which I don't have on me at the moment, in the autobiography of Moshe Leib Lilienblum, who was an early Zionist thinker and writer. And he wrote a brilliant autobiography called Chatot Neurim, which he put under this absurd pseudonym, which I can't even remember, it was so ridiculous. But it was clearly penned by him. And he basically charted the way in which he abandoned traditional Judaism, right? All these early, early Zionist thinkers and ideologues, they all, of course, grew up in the Cheder world, and they were given a full, serious Cheder education. However, at some point, he began to wonder, began to think, and he actually has this paragraph in this autobiography in which he says that basically an important part of his journey started when he picked up Bechinat Hadat, when he picked up Ari Nohem. These were recently published, and started reading into them. And suddenly his eyes were open. Oh my gosh, what you mean? There are excellent arguments against the antiquity and authority of the Zohar, and he started investigating into that. And then he started investigating other things, and basically slowly but surely went downhill, and slowly but surely abandoned the learning and eventually the faith of his religious patrimony. So, I mean, this is also something we haven't really talked about in this series, and something which, as a historian, I don't intend to get to at all, which is, even once you have all the information about the Zohar and its, and arguments against it and the arguments for and against it, as an educator, what are you supposed to do? And what is the correct line to take? But of course, that's not my business. That's not my field. And I don't intend to dive into that.
Yes, it's not the place of this podcast. No. Don't go down the path of Moshe Leib Lilienbaum. Chas v'shalom. The point of this podcast is just to educate and to talk about a fascinating discussion. And it used to be, for those who know it, especially in rabbinic circles. Really, I mean, now we're in the Haskalah portion of the series here, which is interesting. But this is, a fascinating conversation, a fascinating topic. And by the way, I will say, and I mentioned this earlier, the Hamar Zohar, the new 26 volume Zohar, they have a lengthy, they talk about this at length in the introduction. Mosek Midvash, Rabbi Frisch has this in his Sharei Zohar, talks about this. You can read about it there. There's actually a new commentary that came up from the Vilna Gaon, a new edition. Sorry, not a new commentary. Yal Oren in the back, all the way in the back. You can look, and they talk about this as well. Like if you look around, you can see this kind of comes up besides for the articles that JJ's mentioned, things like that. So it is around. But anyways, as you said, this is a historical podcast, a historical conversation about the history of the reception. That's what we're talking about. And so now we are firmly in the Haskalah period, and as you say, right. That these are the figures like Lilienbaum, I think, that people associate with like Haskalim. These are the fry, not from. They came from the yeshiva education. They threw off the yeshiva education. They threw off religion. They said, forget about it. I don't care about it. I hate really whatever they. However far they say, I don't want to go too far, but yes, those are the types. So okay,
all right. Let's move on. Let's move on to the subject, the main subject of this particular episode. It's the subject that I've written about exhaustively, and as you say, have done this translation of this new book, and it is Shadal's Vikuach al Chochmat Kabbalah. It's published as Dialogues on Kabbalah from Palgrave Macmillan, and I've translated it and put a 50-page introduction and 1,000 footnotes and a bunch of glossaries and indexes. I mean, it's a serious point. Yeah.
Yes. So before you get there, I'm not going to steal your thunder about Shadal, and I'm going to let you talk about Shadal. I will just say in the beginning about Shadal Shmuel David Lutzato that I did have a full hour and 45-minute episode a couple of years ago with Daniel Klein, who's translated his works on Chumash. So anyone want to hear more about Shadal, listen to that. I also did an episode with Dan Klein about the one on Targum. And I added an episode about Benamozegh, but really, hopefully, we'll do more on Benamozegh. So with that, turn it over to you, JJ. Talk about Shadal, give his basic information, and let's get into the vikuach.
Okay, so the issue with talking a bit about Shadal, for me at least anyway, is that considering how many years I've done work on him, difficult to wrap it up in 5 or 10 minutes. Another difficulty I have with talking about Shadal is that he's an extremely lovable character, right? It's not just that I've spent many hours working on him. I've spent time working on other figures too, and I haven't grown to love them in the way that one grows to love Shadal, because Shmuel David Luzzatto, who was born in 1800 and died in 1865 in Italy, he was one of the major figures straddling the world of rabbinic on the one side and maskilic on the other. He was a phenomenal scholar, right? He was one of these polymaths who knew not only everything within the Jewish canon, but he also received a very wide and impressive non-Jewish education, all the languages, ancient and modern, all the texts, all the philosophies, he really did know everything. He's one of these figures who not only knew everything, but wrote an enormous amount, dozens and dozens of books, hundreds of essays, over 4,000 letters, which we know of, an enormous literary presentation on basically every facet of Jewish life. He wrote a famous Pirush al Torah. He wrote Pirushim on many other parts of Tanakh. He wrote several works of grammar, several books of essays, one should really go and look Shadal up. Not only was he brilliant, and not only did he have an extraordinary clarity of thought, but he also had an amazingly crystalline and beautiful way of expressing himself. He was possibly one of the greatest Hebrew writers, just in terms of expressing his own thoughts. He was luminously clear and brilliant at putting pen to paper and expressing himself. I want to sort of appeal to those who've had a yeshiva education who are listening to this podcast to cast your mind back to you're going through a sugya in yeshiva, and you're breaking your teeth on a Tosfos or a Rashba, and you're going through it, and it's written in this kind of very thick and turgid and difficult to understand rabbinic parlance, and you're going through it. You really have to spend hours piecing together, and then you open the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, right? And you open the Mishnah Torah, and it's just beautiful, and it's clear, and it's crisp, and you know exactly what he's talking about. You know exactly what he's saying, and it's perfectly well organized, and you can fly through it and gain a tremendous amount of it. Not only because it's brilliant, not only because the Rambam was a genius, but also because the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah had an extraordinary, clear and compelling way of expressing himself, which just gives a lot. Anyway, so this is my sort of a good part of my love of Shadal. Not only is he brilliant, not only did he know everything, not only does he make extremely compelling arguments, he also expresses himself with a clarity that is the envy of every other Jewish scholar in Europe.
Something to add in here that I want to say, as someone also enjoys reading Shadal and enjoys his works, that while your work, and I haven't seen it yet, I'm looking forward to seeing it. The unfortunate part is that you're not having his Hebrew, because anyone that can read Hebrew fairly well should read the original Hebrew, because it's wonderful. It's such a good read. So, anyways, and I'll read some examples of that. Once we get into it, I'll read some examples from the Hebrew just so you can hear his Hebrew. Okay. But anyways,
as I say, al pi shnai medim yakum davar. Anyhow, so this is Shadal. Now, in terms of Shadal's book, Kabbalah, I need to give a couple minutes background, I think, on Shadal's essential philosophy, which would help many understand this, because this is, to my mind, in a way, the magnum opus of this whole genre. It is the perhaps most impressive, but probably the work most worth reading of this entire genre of Zohar criticism. With Ian the 700, this is my opinion. No one has to agree with it necessarily, but and therefore it's worth going into Shadal's philosophy of it, because Shadal really does not like Kabbalah. Really is not a Kabbalah. However, he is also very much not a rationalist. He does not like rationalist medieval Jewish philosophy at all. Doesn't like the Rambam. Doesn't like the like Ralbag or Albo who followed in his way. And so you might ask, what's left? What does he like? What is Shadal's worldview? And basically Shadal's worldview is that the Torah and all the following Jewish texts are fundamentally simple. Okay, not basic, not foolish, not sort of intellectually shallow, God forbid, but rather they are comprehensible to the average person. Okay, and basically Shadal was very opposed to any any philosophical or ideational framework which seeks to impose itself on the Torah text, right? And basically, his whole point is that, when you open the Tanakh, certainly when you open the Torah, and also rabbinic works, so there are texts that tell you what to do or tell you what to believe, and basically, according to Shadal, that is it. That is valid. That alone is sufficient to provide you with all the relevant and important information in order to lead a full and rich Jewish life, which is, of course, the will of God. What he says is that the problem is when you take the Torah or you take the words of Chazal as a kind of symbol or a metaphor for another framework, right? And for the Kabbalists, of course, that framework was the Esesfirot and all the Kabbalistic ideas and the various Olamot and the Partsufim and all the other elements of that. But for the Rambam and the rationalists, the Torah is essentially, again, a kind of a cover, a garb, a symbol for a whole series, a whole philosophical framework of Aristotelian physics and metaphysics, right? And both of these Shadal doesn't like. Both of these Shadal says each of them are just as untenable, illegitimate. They are just as illegitimate as each other, and therefore he set himself very firmly against the excesses, let's say, of Kabbalah, the excesses of the rationalist tradition, including the Rambam. So he actually formed this opinion very early in his life. He was one of these child prodigies who knew everything, by the time he was toddling around. And basically, by the age of 13, he had already read through all the Agadas on Chazal, especially, and basically all the rabbinic literature, and come to the very firm conclusion that the book of the Zohar was a later medieval work. And there's an extraordinary story, actually, at the age of 14, where Shadal is summoned to the deathbed of his mother, who was dying. And his father, who very much believed in Kabbalah, begged him to say a set of tefillah, sort of a Kabbalistically inspired prayers, which invoke all sorts of angels and names of gods, and, the sorts of stuff you can find in various Sidurim. And Shadal refused, which is an extraordinary thing for a 14-year-old to do at the deathbed of his own mother. Say, no, I'm not going to say these prayers because they are praying to angels. They are using all sorts of incantations and trickery and shenanery, and I'm absolutely not interested in this, and basically refused. And that, he reports this himself. We don't know what his father's reaction was or whether that was an irreparable damage. But anyway. Moving on, at the age of 26, Shadal pens this dialogue, which he calls Vikuach al Chochmat Kabbalah ve'al Kadmut Sefer HaZohar ve'al Hanikud ve'al HaTa'amim. Okay, which I've abridged in the title of my translation to Dialogues on Kabbalah or Dialogue on Kabbalah. And this is go on.
And I do want to say that actually the book has a longer title, really, right? The real title of the book is to read it in full. He really has this Nekudas V'Atayim. He really has this really long name. Yeah.
Right. Yes, Nachon. He is exactly. Anyway, so Shadal has Shadal writes his work. Now there's a few very interesting things about this work which I want to bring to attention, especially because I spent so much time on it, even before getting into his claims, into what he actually states about Kabbalah. A couple of things. First thing is that it is a dialogue between two people, essentially the oreach, the guest, and the host, the mechaber, or the author, right? So you have the author, mechaber, who Shadal writes in his first person. What's interesting is that mechaber in the book is the more traditionalist one who defends Kabbalah. In other words, Shadal puts in his own mouth the defense of the Kabbalah, but has this oreach, this gentleman who comes from Poland, this ish, who comes and basically, so to speak, quote unquote, educates him out of it. But what's interesting about this dialogue is that it's not a one-sided dialogue, right? And many of the dialogues that we have in the history of Judaism, such as the Kuzari, such as Shomer Emunim Hakadmon that we mentioned earlier, such as Choker Mukubal from Ramchal or not, etc. All of these are very one-sided vikuchim, very one-sided dialogues. What I mean by that is that there's one person who's quite clearly the mouthpiece of the author, says all the right things, and the other person is just there as a kind of a foil, someone to bounce the ideas off, or someone to ask the pertinent questions or raise the convenient objections, etc. Except here, in the Chochmat Kabbalah, no, both figures say interesting and important and true things, and both of them, in a way, represent two different sides of Shadal's brain. That's the main claim that I make in the introduction, that basically Shadal is conflicted about Kabbalah. Because on the one hand, all his Wissenschaft, maskilic training and instincts cause him to reject Kabbalah and cause him to reject the Zohar as an antique and authoritative text, on the one hand. On the other hand, he's a very traditionalist person. He's a very small C conservative kind of rabbinic Jew, and therefore he wants to defend it, and he wants to defend the rabbinic tradition. He wants to sort of express outrage at those who are trying to undermine the faith of the masses by trying to undermine Kabbalah. And that's what makes this Vikuach a very rich read, not only because it's written brilliantly, not only because it's full of interesting ideas and quotes other books at length, etc., but also because it really is an example of a brilliant mind battling against itself, as it were, and two sides of a person's conflicted loyalties battling against each other. And that's what makes it a brilliant read. Anyway, I think that's quite enough of my piece on how much I like Shadal and this particular book. And it's available in none of the good bookstores because it's too expensive, but probably on Amazon and in other good places. And Nachi, I'm sure, will provide a link in the notes.
So first of all, let's make some introductory comments before we get into the actual book itself. The book, I think it's being like $45 on Amazon or something, but it's not a big book. It's like 150, 200 pages. How big is it? Correct me if I'm wrong. Around there?
Honestly, I don't know exactly the final page count yet. We're recording this a little bit in advance. Yes. But it'll be a couple hundred pages. The book in Hebrew is about 150 pages. In English, it's longer. It's like 220, longer than that, something like that.
So I'll mention, the book in Hebrew, there's ways to get it online. I don't think it's on Hebrew Books, but there's ways that you can find it on Google Books, etc. I'll try to put a link to where you can just see it. It's pretty nice font in the original. There's also a new edition, which hasn't done much in Hebrew, that's published through Carmel. Yonatan Bassi, who's published a lot of Shadal's books, Sfarim into Hebrew. Yes. He published it with a short intro of himself, and then an intro from Professor Chamil, I think, Akadama, and then he has the book itself, and he tried to keep the original pagination, so you have like weird, like big blanks in the bottom. It's kind of a little odd. It's just a nice.
And also no footnotes, which annoyed me like crazy.
Yeah, there's nothing to it. It's about 150 pages. He did translate a letter in the end, so that is available. The book itself that I'm holding says shekel 89 shekel. I don't know if that price has changed, and it's not available in America. Of course, you can get it from Israel. I can try to put a link on it. So another thing just to mention about the book, and I don't know if I don't think you mentioned this. Shadal wrote this book when he was younger, but he only publishes it later in 1852. Yes. He only publishes it later for various reasons. But it's a nice book. It comes up, I actually recently bought a original with inscription from Shadal. Beautiful handwriting, by the way, that he inscribed to somebody. So I think it comes up. It's not very expensive either. And I'm sure JJ would wants a copy. But anyways,
I'm very jealous. I can't believe you got an original copy before I did.
It's not that expensive. I don't think anyone seems to want it. But anyways, there's that, and then let's get to the actual book itself and what he says. And what you said also is interesting. How Shadal himself, it's a pretty fair quote-unquote dialogue. I mean, of course, he's going to come out the side that he wants it to. But for reading a dialogue, It's not extremely one-sided. He also puts some really nice, I'm not going to say that I'll read some examples. He puts some really nice language in the mouth of both. I mean, it's really well done in that regard for dialogue.
Yes, exactly. And that is exactly, that's why it is worth reading. I mean, for various reasons, but one of them is, you say, it's both sides will have something to themselves. And also there's no shattering victory on either side. In other words, it ends in a kind of this aphoretic, ambivalent manner of both sides not particularly happy with how it ends. And anyway, okay, tough. Okay, fine. So what are Shadal's essential claims in the book? And there are many, and he discusses them at great length, and I'm not going to do all of them, but I'll make the point of a few of the most important ones. The first is, and this is right at the beginning of the book, is that he claims essentially that the Zohar managed to escape the system of confirmation. Okay. What do I mean by that? Many have noticed, and we have in fact noticed on this series, the problem of the gaps, right? The fact that there was 1100 years between Rosh Chai and Moshe de Leon, and the Zohar wasn't mentioned. Fine, that is one problem. But Shadal brings our attention to another problem, which is that not only was it not mentioned, but it wasn't confirmed by subsequent generations. Well, what do I mean by this? Basically, he makes the point that, okay, what confirmed the authority, let's say, of the books of the Tanakh was the Chachamim of the Beit Sheni period, right? Of the Beit Sheni period, and what confirmed the authority of the Mishnah was the Talmud. What confirmed the authority of the Talmud was the Savarim and the Gaonim. What confirmed the authority of the Gaonim? The Rishonim. In other words, every single stage of Jewish history, of Jewish text that were ever published, had to be read by subsequent generations, commented upon, ratified, certified, and basically accepted. Right? Why is the Talmud Bavli accepted as the major text for deciding halacha? And the answer is because the Rishonim, the Gaonim, the later generations accepted it as such, right? In other words, and Shadal's point is that the Zohar escaped this system of confirmation, of ratification, of acceptance as a major text for well over 1,000 years. And that is a big problem. That is, and the truth is that this problem has plagued the yeshiva world a little bit also in recent years of, the discovery of books from many hundreds of years ago, which nevertheless were not quoted and were not added in as part of the halachic system. So what do you do with them? But anyway, that's sort of one of Shadal's points that, as far as I know, wasn't mentioned earlier. Now, as I mentioned before, Shadal also equates Kabbalah with philosophy. Right? In other words, in Shadal's eyes, there's a very close connection, and again, more modern academics have confirmed this, very close connection between many of the ideas in the Zohar and Kabbalah and the ideas of ancient and medieval philosophy, right? Various, the three parts of the soul is essentially a Platonic idea, transmigration of souls, reincarnation is also a Pythagorean idea, all sorts of other elements of the Zohar, the notion of the spheres, the 10 sfirot, very much cohere with medieval astronomy and medieval metaphysics, but of course had been overthrown by the time Shadal was writing this in 1826, and et cetera, et cetera. In other words, for Shadal, Kabbalah was very similar to philosophy. But the problem is that in Shadal's eyes, that was a curse. That was terrible, because in Shadal's eyes, the idea of having a system of external philosophy for which the Torah is ultimately only a symbol. In other words, in Shadal's eyes, it cannot possibly be the case that a system of external philosophy or a framework of external ideas constitutes the true core or the true mystical underlying meaning of the Torah's text. For him, that was absolutely untenable. And here's this wonderful passage in the Vikuach, actually. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the final line is something like, Halo tir'eh sheha Kabbalah v'ha-filosofia shel ha'aravim chalom echad hu. Surely you will see that both these sort of the constructs of Arabic philosophy and the constructs of Kabbalah, very similar, which we just discussed, chalom echad hu. They're the same fantasy. They're the same, pie in the sky intellectual construct that actually has nothing to do with the text of the Torah, with the mitzvahs of the Torah, with any part of the Torah that is relevant or important. All of this is just, in his eyes, a kind of later fabrication that got imputed into the Torah text and therefore is not worthy of consideration. Okay, another element which he sort of pounds quite hard is the fact that there are major arguments among the Kabbalists, right? In other words, that especially within earlier Kabbalists, a set of many disagreements concerning the Sfirot, concerning a wide range of issues, and therefore Shadal points out, they claim it's literally a Kabbalah, it's a set of received doctrines. How can it be a set of received doctrines if they're arguing over major points of the theology? How can that be the case? It's another point that Shadal, again, all of these points are brought out in great detail. Now, perhaps the most important, of all of Shadal's contributions, his major innovation in this debate is, as is indicated by the title of the book, Al HaNekudot V'Al HaTa'amim, right? On the vowels and the ta'amim, the trop, the cantillation, right? The laning notes of the Tanakh. Now, nowadays, when you open up any Chumash or any Tanakh that you have, you see the Torah text, but you also see the laning notes. You see the vowels, the comments, the patach, the segel, etc. And this is known generally actually as the Masorah, as the biblical Masorah. And I discussed this actually in the previous podcast episode I did here on Forum Chatter with Christian David Ginsburg. Discussed this a bit at length. And basically, the ones that we have today generally follow the second edition of the Mikrat Gedolot in 1525 from Venice, etc., and not to go too much into it. However, there is a great discussion as to when these Nekudot and Ta'amim, when these particular vowels, right, the comments, the patach, etc., and all the laning notes, when did they come into existence? Who invented them and when? Okay. Why is this important? Because it seems that Chazal were ignorant of them, right? Didn't have them in front of them. Chazal appeared, to the best of our knowledge, to have unvoweled and uncantillated texts in front of them. And we know this firstly because they don't mention the Nekudot and the Ta'amim, or seemingly. Again, there's machloket, maybe one mention here or there, but basically, in general, they don't mention it. And also, you'll find in the Gemara quite often actual machlokot about reading words. How are words how is a certain word supposed to be read, right? And I'm not talking about the al tikre x ella y, right? No, those are drashot. I'm talking about, actual discussions. Sometimes they have halakhic ramifications of whether to read, for example, the words of tuma of after giving birth to a child, the tuma yoledet, whether it's shiv'im or shavu'ayim, right? Different ways of vowelating the words. And of course, had they had actually vowelated a text in front of them, they would just have to check, right? And this has been confirmed more recently by the Qumran, the Megillot Qumran, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, all of which also don't have vowels or cancellation marks. And this argument essentially that the vowels and cancellation marks as we have them today, right, the actual diacritical marks, the shapes, the actual marks that we have today, they were put in by what's generally known as the Anshe Masorah, or Anshe Tiberia, between about the 5th and the 9th century. And this was argued at length by Eliyahu Bachor, right, Elijah Levita, in the 1500s. And basically he argues this at length in the third introduction of his Masorah HaMasoret. I recommend everyone read it, especially Ginsburg's translated version. But the point is that there's only one book that we have that's supposedly from the ancient period that actually does talk about the vowels by name and makes drashot on them, and actually does talk about the laning notes by name and makes drashot on them. That is, of course, the Zohar. In other words, the Zohar occupies this strange place because it is an ancient book. Oh, sorry, let me try again. It purports to be an ancient book. Yeah, Freudian slip, right? It purports to be an ancient book. It sells itself as a book from the Tannaitic period, but it talks about the Nekudot, and it talks about the Ta'amim, and it infers them unlike any other book in the whole of Chazal. And basically, if it can be proven that it is in fact a much later invention, which basically is accepted by the academic world today and has been essentially since Elijah Levita in the 1500s, if this is accepted, then of course the Zohar, or at least all those passages that mention Nekudot and Ta'amim, have to be after the 9th or 10th century. In other words, you cannot talk about a patach and a segol and a zarka and a munach and a segol, etc. You cannot talk about any of these terms before they were invented in the post-Babylonian Talmud period, right? If these things didn't exist, then all those passages in the Zohar, and by extension possibly the whole Zohar itself, also has to be much later. And this is the point that Shadal makes, right? And what's interesting, and Shadal actually makes a great length and great and with great verve, etc. And what he also points out very interestingly is that we think of the Nekudot and Ta'amim as absolutely the ones that we have in front of us as absolutely ancient and authoritative and couldn't possibly be different, etc. And Shadal in his Vikuach shows how each of the major Mefarshim, Rashi, Rashbam, Ibn Ezra, Ramban, Abarbanel, all of them sometimes reads psukim against the vowels or against the trop, against the cancellation notes. In other words, he shows that actually even in the early medieval period, even a few centuries after these things were written, they weren't set in stone. They weren't seen as absolutely authoritative because all of these figures have certain pirushim against the Nekudot and against the Ta'amim. And this is, to me, the Shadal's major innovation, because Rav Yaakov Emden does mention this, that the Zohar has the names of the vowels and the names of the cancellation marks, and that's a strike against it. He mentions that. But Shadal goes much further. No, it's not only that Chazal or Rishon Bar Yochai wouldn't have had the names, he wouldn't have had the vowels, he wouldn't have had the cancellation marks, because this has been shown to be a much later invention. And that is, for me, and seemingly Shadal's major innovation, and also, again, if you accept the conclusion of Shadal and Yaakov and Eliyahu Bachor and others, that this is in fact a later innovation, then it seems to be a very strong point against the antiquity of the Zohar. He makes a bunch of other points. He doesn't like the ethical, some ethical parts of the Zohar, some of the more, let's say, over the top, quote unquote, drashot of the Zohar. He also has a very amusing line where basically he says that the Zohar actually has 9 messianic predictions, right? Everyone knows this. It has 9 different times in which it says a year in which Mashiach is supposed to come, all of which, incidentally, are in the early 1300s, and what would be the odds, right? If, it seems to be a good point in favor of the book being written just before then. And basically 8 of them, by the time Shadal was writing this, 8 of them had come to pass. Those years had come to pass. And of course, Mashiach hadn't come, unfortunately. And Shadal has this very cutting and scything line. But it's a book full of very sharp humor and wit and kind of snarky asides, each one to each other. It's a wonderful read. But Shadal says that, the ninth messianic prediction, is still yet to come to pass when he was writing this in 1826. And he says, hey, maybe it will actually come to pass if we stop using the Zohar and stop paying attention to it, and maybe by ignoring the Zohar, maybe by throwing it out, we'll actually have Mashiach coming in the year that the Zohar actually predicted. So anyway, it's obviously much better written in the original Hebrew, that joke. But nonetheless, so these are, I think, the major. There are other points that Shadal brings in, and maybe Nachi, you have other points you want to identify. But basically, the system of confirmation, the general attack on Kabbalah as being very similar to philosophy, the fact there are arguments among the Kabbalists, and also mainly the Nekudot and the Ta'amim, which he explains at length of their Genesis and how we can tell, how we can date them, etc. And also investigates the one or two times Chazal they seem to come up or not. And basically arguing for their late date, which of course drags the Zohar much later as well.
Yeah, so just in brief to add, I mean, the latter half, the latter third of the book is really where he goes into on the Zohar, and he, like you said, the things that you mentioned, he also repeats some of the things in Yaakov Emden, or he expounds upon them. The beginning is really against Kabbalah, and he talks about the ancientness of Kabbalah, and he talks about the Mechaber, one who's pro-Kabbalah says, well, there's all these old books. And he says, no, they're not. They're actually not. And they go back and forth. It's just some of the things just to read his language. And he goes, one of the quotes is, he says, isn't the Ramban a Makubal? And how could you say otherwise? He says, Omer Hamanaz, Ramban's a Kabbalah Mitis. Hagam, you also say he's a tricker? The Shadal basically answers back. The guest says, Chalilili machshav kazois al nasi ale kim asher kamayu in safek kol dvarav mekubalim hayu etzle merabayis. A really cute punning on in Kabbalah. He accepted everything at Kabbalah. So he says back, ve'ech yimtzu libcha lahachesh divrei Kabbalah so in zekim rayalev. What are you saying? So he says back, in rayalev aval ze mechoyvas ishi Israeli lidjush velachker mativom shal advarim hanemar beKabbalah. And he goes on and on. Some other interesting things. He talks about also the Sefer Yetzirah. They talk about the Sefer Yetzirah, and
yes.
The Mechaber, one of the things says, how do you not admit Bekadmas Kabbalah Seino V'lo Yisaydas Al Sefer Yetzirah Shu Nizkar B'Talmud Sefer Yetzirah is quoted. So Shadal says back, Moidani Bekadmas Sefer Yetzirah V'zeh Mishnei Time, and he goes on and they go back and forth about the Sefer Yetzirah. But that's what I mean. Some of the things where he's kind of putting in the anti-Kabbalist. Now, of course, he's going to explain away Sefer Yetzirah that it's not the Sefer Kabbalah, but he's kind of giving at least both sides some sort of something. But his writing is really, I don't know if I'm doing justice to giving the writing is really very enjoyable to read. And it's pretty understandable what he is saying throughout the book. And then there's the middle, he goes kind of on. And I don't know if you mentioned that the book was set up purportedly by Hoshana Rabbah, that the guest comes from Poland on Hoshana Rabbah night, and Hoshana Rabbah speaks Kabbalistic night, and the whole thing. And then, because then later on he says, Balel Simchas Torah, and Balayla, he gives you this kind of story. I don't know if there's any, have you done any research into whether Shadal just made this all up, or whether there was actually somebody they at least had a conversation with?
No. So firstly, in the book itself, in the Vikuach itself, there is this appendix at the end in which Shadal himself speaks in his own voice, basically saying, Lo hayav lo nivra, like obviously the story I made it up, but no, there is also, as part of this dialogue, it's not just Stam dialogue, there is plot, there is setting, there is humor. They go back and forth to shul, they're in his house, they're back from his house. And in my introduction to the book, in this translation, I really sort of go through it and I really point out the literary aspects that make this dialogue not just Stam, a dialogue between two people, but also very having those literary facets as well, which contributes to the overall message of the book. As I explore that, I don't want to give too much away because people won't necessarily buy it. But yes, the truth is, one interesting facet that you brought out just there in your in what you mentioned then, the point you were making, is that both sides actually sort of try to out-from each other, which is an interesting part of this dialogue. In other words, both sides, both the anti-Kabbalist side and the pro-Kabbalist side, are both accusing the other one of being substandard in their observation, in the observance, in their in the conception of Jewish ideas and Jewish life, and both of them see the other one as backwards in a way, or unfortunately not grasping the truth as it should be grasped. So it's a very interesting text, and can't recommend it enough. And I actually agree with you, Nachi, that those who can read it in the Hebrew should. But if you want an English translation, which is a good translation, but you're right, maybe in a future edition, somewhere, I will put the English next to Hebrew because it's just beautiful Hebrew, so it's worth it.
What I'm going to say here, JJ, is I look forward to seeing yours because I know you have an extensive introduction and you have footnotes, which would be really helpful reading the book. But that being said, I would advocate for listeners to kind of do both. Read the original Hebrew. I think if you can read Hebrew, it's worth reading the beautiful Hebrew. But get JJ so you could see the introduction and the notes because that would be helpful because the Hebrew one doesn't have it. I think you're buying two books, but you can read the Hebrew online though. The old printing is really nice. You can get that, and maybe there's a way to print it off. We can figure out a way to get it onto like Amazon Print on Demand or something. I don't think it's there. Those are really cheap for a couple of bucks. You can order it, and then just to read the you can read the notes. Okay, so that's really
right. And my translation is one of these strange books. Actually, you need to buy 4 or 5 copies to understand it properly. So it's that's an important facet of that. Anyway, yes, let's move on to the next part of this, which is the great Bar Plukta of Shadal.
Benamozegh, who I'll let you explain who he was. I've done a little bit on him on the podcast. Not enough. There's more to do on him. A really fascinating figure as well, with a lot of writings. Really, also polymath in some different ways because a Kabbalist. And you can talk about him. And he, as we already said, I'll let you talk about him. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. No, the truth is, so Eliyahu Benamozegh, as you were saying, was a fascinating figure. He was also an Italian rabbi. He was born in 1823 and he died in 1900. He was he was very much a maverick, okay? Like Shadal, a precocious child. Like Shadal, had a very broad education, both in every facet of Jewish texts, but also through non-Jewish texts. He had a very broad knowledge of science and of philosophy and literature, etc. And funnily enough, a bit like Shadal, he saw this as very important. So even though he very much opposed Shadal's work in Kabbalah, he joined him in acknowledging the importance of critical investigation, the importance of having a Jewish commentary on Jewish texts, which were very much informed and aligned with the very best of science, the very best of philosophy, and the very best of Kabbalah, etc. And we're actually going to get into this in a moment. Into the philosophical element because it's very important. But basically, Benamozegh also. So over his life, he actually wrote 2 responses to anti-Kabbalistic works. The first was a response to the Ari Nohem. So before Shadal Shadal only published his Vikuach in 1852. So before then, Benamozegh wrote a very short response to the Ari Nohem called the Emas Mafgia al Ha'ari Nohem, which and all of Benamozegh's titles had very clever puns in them. And so that was a sort of a shorter response. And then he wrote another dialogue in response to Shadal's Vikuach, which was called Ta'am Lashad, right, which is another pun based on the Parashas Haman, whereas the Ta'am Lashad was the taste of the month. Of course, Lashad is an acronym Shadal. And essentially was another dialogue. Unfortunately, Benamozegh did not have nearly the literary capabilities of Shadal. It's actually much more of a slug than Shadal's dialogue, which is very beautiful and easy to read. But nonetheless, Benamozegh was a very unusual critic of Shadal, very unusual defender of the Kabbalah for a couple of reasons. Firstly, was because of his general philosophy. Okay, his general philosophy was that, or part of his general philosophy was a very, very universalistic kind of Judaism, right? And Clemence Beluc from Columbia has recently written a good book on the subject of Benamozegh, and others have written on this. But basically, it was a very, very wide-ranging universalistic form of Judaism, and essentially, he believed in an ancient universal religion, right? An ancient body of doctrines accepted by all the ancient peoples, in which there was this a generally accepted set of beliefs about God and about the world and knowledge about creation, etc. But unfortunately, over time, this got corrupted and this got driven underground, as it were, and only remains the sort of this initial pristine, perfect knowledge about God and about the universe remains, according to Benamozegh, as today only in the form of Kabbalah, right? And he believes Jewish mysticism to be this ancient repository of perfect knowledge and perfect understanding about God, etc., which once was known by everyone, which once was the common religious patrimony of all human beings, right? And therefore what? And therefore, according to him, firstly, in his eyes, it really doesn't matter to him, or at least so he writes, when the Zohar was written, right? Because in his mind, the point is about Kabbalah. The point is about the doctrines and the ideas and the sort of construct of Kabbalah. And this single book of the Kabbalah doesn't really make or break it in his perspective. Now, this is, of course, very different to many of the other writers on Kabbalah, especially those who try and defend it, because, of course, in the eyes of many, Kabbalah, the ancient Jewish mysticism, the ideas of it, stand or fall with the authenticity of the Zohar, right? In other words, the Zohar is undoubtedly the centerpiece of Kabbalah. It is undoubtedly the most influential and important work in this tradition. And if it can be shown that this is in fact not the book it purports to be, but it's actually a later book, perhaps a forgery, perhaps fraudulent, perhaps including all sorts of illegitimate passages, then that, for most, is a very serious blow against Kabbalah in general. Whereas Benamozegh, basically, his idea was, and he writes it, says, mach patli, like, it's actually not important. He doesn't use those words, of course, but it's not important at all to him, the actual date of the composition of the Kabbalah. Rather, it is important that you acknowledge that it reflects these ancient ideas from this pristine universal religion. So that's sort of the first point. The second point, the second consequence of this is that he believes that, of course, you're going to see echoes of Kabbalistic doctrines in ancient philosophy and in medieval philosophy and in ancient literature. And, in all of the, literature of the Greeks and the Romans and the Babylonians, etc. And basically, for people like Shadal, the more you can prove that the Zohar relies or is connected to outside ideas, the ideas external to the Jewish tradition, the worse it is, right? The more this is damning, let's say, to the Kabbalah and the Zohar. However, for someone like Benamozegh, quite the contrary. Every time that you prove the Zohar has a very similar idea or a parallel idea in Plato or Aristotle or Pythagoras or the Neoplatonic or the Christian tradition or whatever it is, the more Benamozegh says, you see, Kabbalah is universal. It is something that once everyone knew and once everyone had possession of, and now, unfortunately, only the Jews have possession of it. It only survived really in our tradition, but it does reflect this ancient, perfect, secret tradition, and therefore says, it has parallels with philosophy and with literature. Excellent, good. You shouldn't expect anything else. Right? That's another. Those are sort of the major elements of Benamozegh's defense. Is A, the dating doesn't really matter so much, and B, its parallel or its resemblance to outside sources. Not only doesn't it matter, it's encouraging. Good, we expect that. Okay, fine. He also goes after he quotes the Raman and understanding a philosophy as learned, ancient Greek philosophy as learned from the Jews, and there's a whole story of Plato going and meeting Yirmiyahu, even though they were 200 years apart, but whatever. Plato going and meeting Yirmiyahu Hanavi and getting his philosophical knowledge and wisdom from him, etc. Whatever. We'll put that all to one side. But basically, Benamozegh was an ultimate. He believed in a sort of syncretistic understanding of ancient ideas and philosophy and religion and knowledge, which again makes him very different from other defenders of Kabbalah. He also was at pains to point out the many, many overlapping elements of Kabbalah and Ma'marei Chazal, right? So he goes through Midrashim, he goes through the Gemara showing, this idea is somewhat similar, somewhat, has parallels in the Zohar, etc. And also, not just ideas, but even minhagim, right? So, for example, in Chazal, you have you do something on Moshe Shabbos, and that has the whole idea of the Neshama Yesera, right? And again, Benamozegh sort of takes this as proof that Chazal had the idea of different neshamot and of Gilgulim, etc., and sort of expands that, as it were. And he also counters Shadal's point of Shadal says there are many arguments among the Mekubalim, right? The differences of opinion, and therefore it can't really be said to be this kind of ancient, pristine tradition. Whereas Benamozegh counters and says, "What do you mean? Arguments? That's everywhere in Chazal. Like every piece of Torah Sheba'al Peh we have is shot through with arguments, and yet we see that as as part or as reflecting or as the outworking of a pristine ancient tradition, which we accept going back to Sinai." So basically, he says that the Zohar and Kabbalistic literature more generally is a legitimate part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and like other legitimate parts of Torah Sheba'al Peh, you'll find arguments, and you'll find different traditions, and you'll find different interpreters of it, and you'll find those who express it differently, and that's fine. That's completely legitimate, and that is to be expected. And yeah, other arguments as well. He has this sort of theory of Yerida Sadoros in which the Zohar had to be revealed at a certain point, just like the Mishnah had to be revealed at a certain point, even though it was written that it was only orally beforehand. And there during the 13th century was exactly the time the Jewish people required the Zohar, needed it, and therefore there was a sort of a harasha in order to be able to reveal it to the public, etc., and brings out arguments like that. And finally, I think the part that that is common with him and really all defenders of the Kabbalah even nowadays is that you can't argue with success, right? In other words, the Kabbalah has in fact entered into halachic mainstream, has entered into the Minhag Yisrael, has entered into teachings and Pirush al-Torah, has entered really into all the branches of Torah and Jewish living and practice, etc. And therefore, difficult to say, we have to throw this out because it clearly has been accepted. Retrospectively, you can tell that it is legitimate because it has been accepted, both by great authorities, but also by the masses.
So some things to note about Benamozegh, which is interesting. So you mentioned Professor Baluk. I had her on, talked about her book a while ago. But there's a lot more. So his main magnum opus, which was published after he died by his student who wasn't Jewish, is Israel and Humanity. And so that there's an abridged English version published of that. There was different editions of the French, but just there's an abridged English version. There's also been a complete English version in 3 volumes published by this interesting press. So you can kind of see that book if you want. His main Hebrew writing, I think, would be Eimel Mikra, which is his commentary on Chumash that the Syrian Rabbanim burned, actually tossed into the fire. It's Chumash with his commentary. But Chaim Palagi defended him, and the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim defended him. He wrote a defense called Sirei Galad. So there's actually Bereshis in one volume, Shmais V'Yirka in another, has been published by Arvi Yeshua, Rabbi Zaini in Israel has been publishing them. He publishes these 2 volumes, beautiful, with notes and translations. A really, really, really good job. I wish that the Hebrew Shadal would have been done like that, where, even when he quotes in his Chumash commentary, he quotes archaeologists, and it's got everything. It's got philosophy and archaeology and Kabbalah, everything all together, but there's all this translations. It's telling you who's what. It's a really nice edition. So that there's Bereshit Shemais and Vayikra. There's also, they published 2 of his other works translated from French, I believe. Musar Yehudi L'umas Musar Noitzri, I think. There's one other that's his Jewish and Christian ethics, and there's been another one that's published. So there's a number of books, and Professor Alessandro Guetta has a book on him. There's been a number of stuff written about him, and you can read up more on him if you're interested. I know that he got involved. He has some Hebrew books also about the cremation. I think he has a book about that, a Hebrew book. He has some halacha, something Mana Rash, if I remember correctly. He's got some other stuff. I discussed him. He came up when I did a podcast with Professor Jessica Marglin about I'm trying to remember, the rich guy who dies in Italy in the 19th century. Forgetting right now. And there comes up the question of, is Yerusha? Was he Italian? Was he French? Was he Algerian? And so Benamozegh comes up in there and he writes a book. I'm forgetting offhand. The Shamama case, and the Shamama book, he wrote something. There's a lot about him. There's a lot of, it's interesting. So there's, more to do on him. And as I mentioned on Shadal, just to mention, so link to JJ's book when it's out, right. There's also one. Dan Klein has done 4 volumes now. He's working on Tvarim right now on the translation of Shadal's Chumash. There's the Hebrew edition of the Chumash, but also, and we're going to get to the letters in one second. I don't think we mentioned the letters between Shadal and Benamozegh that Dan Klein translated, and JJ, you edited that volume and put it out. I do want to mention though, so I created for this in preparation a big volume which has Ari Noyam, and then afterwards Emas Mafkia, which is Benamozegh's counter to that, and then followed by Shadal's Vikuach, followed by Benamozegh's response. It's a pretty big book. I got it printed out. So the thing about it is, I'm not sure. I have to find out when it was put together from all the stuff that's available in the public domain. The thing is that it was a bit pricey to print out. So if I can figure out a way to make it kind of affordable, I'll post a link here. If not, people can reach out to me, find out if there's a way to get the file or there's a way to do something about it. Because it's nice. It's got all these kind of, even though it starts with Madana, but it's kind of the back and forth, kind of they build on each other a little bit. So there's a lot of these texts are available. Some of these texts, for example, for whatever reason, Benamozegh's Emas Mafkia, it's in 2 separate volumes. That's available like on print on demand on Amazon. Which I'll put on there, but some of the other ones are not. Okay, so now I think we should mention the letters. I don't think we mentioned the letters. Would you like to mention the letters?
Let's go in for that, because that's very interesting stuff. So you have Shadal and Benamozegh, who were living sort of overlapping in their lives in Italy. Shadal was 23 years older than Benamozegh. He was considered sort of the senior rabbinic figure in Italy at the time by general acclaim, the senior rabbinic sage, as it were. And they did have a bit of a back and forth earlier, in various parts of their lives. And Daniel Klein has written on this and has traced some of this in an article of his. But basically, at a certain point, Benamozegh writes this response to Shadal's Vikuach. He writes the Tam Lashad, and he wants to seek get a response from Shadal. And Shadal basically declines, doesn't respond to him. And then in a letter to another person, Benamozegh makes a remark about him, and Shadal says, I intend to let him bray, like a donkey. I did let him bray. And this remark gets back to Benamozegh. And Benamozegh gets very annoyed at this and writes to Shadal, trying to elicit, some sort of response from him about the Kabbalah thing and expressing his how upset he is that he's been referred to in this way, etc. And thus begins a series of letters between Shadal and Benamozegh, in which, and it's a very interesting, I would say, even psychological portrait of the two men. Okay, because the younger man, Benamozegh, is desperately trying to get on Shadal's good side. So you see him flattering Shadal and trying to goad him and trying to just get any response to him, elicit some kind of response that shows that that Shadal and Benamozegh are colleagues, are playing in the same game, playing in the same field, etc. But the problem is that Shadal by then was very old. I mean, not so much chronologically, but he was towards the end of his life. He was 63 years old. He'd already lost 5 children. Okay, he had a really quite terrible life. He lost 5 children. His wife died young. He by then he was basically blind as well, and was constantly ill. Was very poor. Basically, Shadal lived a miserable life. And by the time that Benamozegh wrote to him, Shadal was almost dead, and he knew it. And he wasn't really willing to engage with Benamozegh the letters. But nonetheless, these letters are very powerfully, go very interestingly back and forth. There's not so much in terms that adds so much to the topic that we're discussing here about the antiquity of the Kabbalah, because Shadal does refuse to engage. There is one very interesting point in which Benamozegh brings up, where he says to Shadal, he says, listen, shortly is Rosh Hashanah, and we are both going to be sitting in shul, and we are going to be listening to the shofar. And basically what Benamozegh argues there is that, listen, for you, Shadal, listening to the shofar is going to be, it'll be what it'll be. It won't be such a moving thing. Why? Because you can only conceive of the shofar on the pshat level, right? Shadal was very, very much a pashtan. You don't believe in Kabbalah. You don't believe in any of these, many sort of deeper interpretations of the tkiyos of the shofar, because of course the Kabbalists invest enormous amounts of significance in every blow and every sequence, and you're supposed to have a kavanah for this and understanding of that, and it's a for them the tkiyos of the shofar are a whole world of experience and ideas in and of themselves. And basically Benamozegh says to Shadal, listen, I kind of pity you, right? He says that you'll be sitting there in shul listening to the shofar, and for you, it'll be a sort of a national custom that commemorates something that was once in the Tanakh, where blowing the shofar used to be a sign of approaching warfare, or to get people ready for battle, or whatever it is, and or to crown a king, whatever. And you're it's sort of a zichron teruah, as it were, for you. It's a kind of a throwback to something that once was significant. Whereas for me, he's saying, the shofar is omni-significant. It has all sorts of layers upon layers upon layers of signification. Therefore, for me, it's a much richer and much more, religiously meaningful experience, right? And Shadal doesn't really respond to this point so much. But the letters in general are very interesting, very intimate. They weren't meant to be published publicly, at least originally, only put down much later. But these letters, which, as you mentioned earlier, have been translated by Daniel Klein and appear in the book that I edited called Letters on Kabbalah, published by Dad Press, and available for a very reasonable price on Amazon, especially if you give it 5 stars. And it's a it's a very interesting and intimate portrait of these two men, well translated, well footnoted from the original Italian. And you get the sense it doesn't really, as I said, doesn't really add extra dimensions to the general discussion we've been having, but it does give a portrait into the minds and the ways of thinking of these two titanic individuals, and the way in which it's almost a missed opportunity historically, because halavai, this exchange could have happened 10 or 20 years earlier, when Shadal was the most feared Jewish intellectual basically in Europe, right? His pen, his essays, his reviews, his critiques, his poetry was seen as devastating in a way, and people used to solicit it, and he was in his prime, Shadal was this lion that sort of bestrode the European Jewish world of letters, whereas by this point you see a very old and very weary and very ill man just trying to blow off or just trying to give Benamozegh the most cursory treatment. It's a chaval, sort of a missed opportunity, but nonetheless the letters are very interesting and I highly recommend their perusal.
Actually, I mentioned before that I got the Shadal's inscribed Vikuach. I also got in the same batch, it was like in a batch of stuff, the letters, the original edition of the letters. Benamozegh inscribed it, that they're actually in Italian, but it is an inscription from Benamozegh on the cover to the rabbi of Haskalah, so Haskalah Monferrato, in the Piedmont, and he inscribed it to him, sending it to him. So I guess he was sending it around. I don't know if he asked him for it. He was just sending it to different rabbis in the region. I'm not sure exactly. But another thing to mention just about Benamozegh and Shadal. So he was very taken with Shadal. I don't know if he was looking for his respect or what it was of his elder colleague in Italy, because if you look in his Chumash, in Elam Mikro, he's always busy with Shadal. Anyone, especially the new edition, he's always busy. He's quoting Shadal. He's attacking Shadal. He's bringing him up like he's the busiest with Shadal of anybody. And the new one brings it down in the notes. He's very, very, very busy with Shadal, something that he's busy with in a lot of his books. But I don't know if did you mention we mentioned Emas Mafkia. That's Benamozegh's response to Arinam. Did you mention any of the points from there?
The points that I mentioned were common to were sort of an aggregation of both. But before I move on, before we end this episode, there's a final excursus I want to take now that we've done Shadal and Benamozegh, which is a slightly more broad overview of Kabbalah versus philosophy. Okay, what do I mean here? Within this whole tradition that we've outlined above, of pro-Kabbalah, anti-Kabbalah, pro-Zohar, anti-Zohar, etc., there is a running debate that encompasses all sides about whether or not Kabbalah is fundamentally similar or different to medieval philosophy, and whether or not that's a good thing for philosophy or whether or not that's a good thing for Kabbalah. Okay? Let me just outline the positions, because I think it's very interesting, because it kind of it doesn't neatly divide the two sides. In fact, there are those, as you'll see in a moment. So basically, there's one position which says that Kabbalah is opposite to philosophy. Kabbalah is different. Kabbalah is a received tradition, handed down. It is esoteric. It is mystical. It basically has very little to do with philosophy, and that is to the detriment of Kabbalah. Because philosophy is wonderful, and philosophy is rigorous, and philosophy is the sustained, serious ideas that undergo critique and undergo rigorous, back and rigorous cut and thrust intellectually, and therefore, therefore Kabbalah, because it stands in pale contrast to philosophy, because it's clearly inferior to philosophy, therefore it's bad, right? And that was the position of the Bechinat Hadat and the Ari Nohem and others, where basically Kabbalah is different from philosophy, it is inferior to philosophy, it is. And precisely because it is not like philosophy, and we like philosophy, and philosophy is good, and philosophy is the right way to go, and it's the right thing to try and integrate into Judaism. Therefore, Kabbalah is inferior. Therefore, we shouldn't pay attention to it. That's the position that I know him. However, of course, you have others like Shomer Emunim and the Magen Vetzina and others who basically say you're right. Kabbalah is the opposite of philosophy, but that's to the detriment of philosophy. Otherwise, Shomer Emunim Hakadmon and the Magen Vetzina and others basically say, listen, philosophy, everyone's always arguing over everything. Nobody ever reaches a real conclusion. It is just kind of an extended navel gazing on the part of a small group of intellectuals, whereas Kabbalah is pristine. It's passed down. It's a genuine tradition. It has the ultimate stamp of authority of antiquity and venerability, and therefore Kabbalah is the opposite of philosophy, but that is to philosophy's detriment, not Kabbalah. Kabbalah is superior precisely because it's not like philosophy. Therefore, it's superior. That is that position. Now, there is the other side, which says, no, Kabbalah is actually fundamentally similar to philosophy. There are great parallels between the doctrines of Kabbalah on the one side and the doctrines of philosophy on the other side. And depending on who you ask, whether it's a good thing or not. So, for example, if you ask Shadal would say Kabbalah and philosophy are fundamentally the same. They have very, very similar ideas, and that's really bad for Kabbalah because philosophy is bad. In other words, because philosophy is, as Shadal thinks, this kind of centuries-long distraction, essentially, from the real pshat of the Torah. And because it's this, very inconclusive, and again, by the time he's writing in the 19th century, conclusively disproven all the neo-Aristotelian medieval physics and metaphysics, etc. Shadal basically thinks that medieval philosophy is a really bad influence in the history of Judaism. And because Kabbalah is so similar to it, because the Zohar contains so many of medieval philosophical doctrines, therefore we should throw out the Zohar because it is similar to philosophy. Whereas Benamozegh agrees with Shadal that Kabbalah and philosophy are the same, or not the same. They are very similar. They contain many similar doctrines, many similar ideas, many a shared vocabulary and a shared set of doctrines. But that is to the benefit of Kabbalah. That is wonderful because he sees there to be a sort of ancient universal set of ideas expressed by societies in the classical world and the medieval world. And Kabbalah, of course, being the most ancient and most pristine, will have similarities and will have parallels with all of these systems. So essentially, you have this is just sort of an excursus, but I find it fascinating. Kabbalah and philosophy, are they similar or are they different? And even if you agree they're similar, or even if you agree they're different, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And does it show the superiority of philosophy or does that show the superiority of Kabbalah? These are fascinating different opinions that emerge from the discussions that we have been having over the last 4 episodes.
Okay. So that's the end of the 4th episode, and I'll definitely what I can say is I'll definitely link in the show's notes to JJ, whether it's published or coming soon, translation of the Vikuach. I'll also link to the letters on Kabbalah published by Dot Press. Those 2 are readily available. Like I said, Amos Mafkia is available on Amazon. I can link to that easily. The Vikuach and the other volumes, I'm going to figure out if there's a way to get them. If not, maybe I can link to a link where you can download the PDF. You can definitely search for it. For some reason, like Benamozegh and Hebrew books, but Shadal is not. I think Basi talks about that in his introduction to his Vikuach. He's upset about that. But I will link to what I can from what we discussed in this episode. And coming next will be the fifth and final episode. So thank you, JJ, for joining me for the 4th episode.
20th century.
Thank you for joining me for the 4th episode.
Looking forward to the next.